Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American Spy Fox, and today we are going to continue with the story of Nirvana, Come As You Are. We're on Chapter 5. I'm not going to edit this video as much as I have previous videos, so if I make a mistake, well, I'll just try not to make any mistakes. Alright, here we go. A SubPop bio at the time listed the band's influences as HR Pufnstuf, Speed Racer, Divorces, Drugs, Sound Effects Records, The Beatles, Rednecks, Hard Rock, Punk Rock, Leadbelly, Slayer, and of course, The Stooges. Nirvana sees the underground scene as becoming stagnant and more accessible to big league capitalist pig major record labels, the bio continued. But does Nirvana fell sick? A moral duty to fight this cancerous evil? No way. We want to cash in and suck up to the bigwigs in hopes that we too can get high and fuck. Get high and fuck. Get high and fuck. On June 9th, Nirvana played Lame Fest 89 at the Moore Theatre. This is where it all begins. And I know I'm already interrupting, but basically Bruce Pavitt, Jonathan Poneman take all the money they have. They get all their best bands, Mudhoney, Tad, Nirvana, whoever else was there, and they try to fill the Moore Theatre. It had never been done before. All these bands could make money at, pubs, bars like the Crocodile, at the local taverns, but they had never filled a 1,500 to 2,000 seat theater before. So what they thought was, well, if we put all of our bands together for one big show and call it Lame Fest 89, then we'll be able to fill that theater. And they did, and they made a bunch of money from it. And then they thought, well, if we can do it in America, maybe we can do it in Britain. And that's when the next year Nirvana goes on their European tour with Tad and Mudhoney and all those guys, and they fill up the Astoria Theatre in London. So this is where it all begins for Nirvana. This is when everyone realizes that these bands can make it in the big leagues. On June 9th, Nirvana played Lame Fest 89 at the Moore Theatre, opening for Tad and Mudhoney. Yes, they were at the bottom of the barrel. It was a landmark event. Local bands had never packed such a large place before. The Seattle scene was starting to explode. The reviewer for Backlash bemoaned the bad sound treatment Nirvana received because the band utilizes a lot of melody within their grunge. As for their performance, totally intense, the review continued. Hair explosions, pratfalls, jumps, body writhing, and a thrashathon finale that left instruments and bodies strewn about the stage. In an article in the University of Washington newspaper, Kurt said the band's music had a gloomy, vengeful element based on hatred. The piece added that Kurt's outlook had improved of late, leading to what Kurt called a gay pop song phase that will eventually die. Although there would probably be more such tunes on the next album, I'd like to live off the band, Kurt added. I can't handle work. They did a session at Evergreen State College, which yielded an early version of Dive and a cover of Kiss's Do You Love Me, which wound up on a tribute album on the Seattle indie label C-Z Records called Hard to Believe. Around this time, Nirvana decided that they needed a contract with SubPop. They wanted to make sure they would get accurate and timely accounting statements. We thought if we signed a contract, says Kurt, we'd be able to hold it up against them in the future if we wanted to get out of their contract. Ironically, the contract eventually had the opposite effect. And as we will learn very soon, this is why you see SubPop's label on the back of a DGC-produced Nevermind. As it happened, SubPop had been thinking along the same lines, and Poneman had been reading This Business of Music for tips on a standard contract for all of the label's roster. Only Soundgarden had signed one at that point. Poneman had not yet drafted anything when one summer night, Pavitt had thrown a wild disco party for the visiting babes in Toyland. As Pavitt recalls, the party got a little out of hand, so he booted everybody out and they all went next door where the babes were staying. Meanwhile, an inebriated Chris Novoselic walked up to Pavitt's house, banged on the window, hollered, "You fuckers, we want a contract," and fell backward into some bushes. He got up to leave and by sheer coincidence bumped into Pavitt, who was going back to his house. I often wonder, says Pavitt, what if I had stayed next door for one more minute? And what he's saying is once Nirvana goes to the big leagues, to DGC, Hi-Hat Shut Up, DGC has to pay Pavitt and Poneman to let Nirvana out of their contract, and that single-handedly saves SubPop. They were going bankrupt, but all the money they got from DGC to let Nirvana out of this contract is actually what saved SubPop and put SubPop on the map. right? On an international map. It was already on the local map. They talked for about 45 minutes or so, after which Pavitt called Poneman and told him Nirvana wanted a contract. Poneman stayed up all night typing a document. Legally speaking, it was a blunt instrument, but it would serve the label in good stead soon enough. Soon, Kurt, Chris, Chad, and Jason were up at SubPop's offices signing the contract, making them the first band to sign an extended contract with the label. I remember thinking, this could be important, says Bruce Pavitt. At first, the album didn't make a seismic impact on the indie scene, or even on SubPop for that matter. Bleach sounded really good, but all our stuff sounded really good to me, says Poneman. I was caught up with a lot of stuff we were putting out, adds Pavitt. We were putting out a lot of really good records. But then people started buying it. We put out Bleach, says Pavitt, and gosh, it just kept selling. Never ever in the history of our company have I ever seen a record just sell and sell and sell. They did tour, but a lot of bands tour. The word of mouth was there. There was something special there. After Bleach was released in June of 1989, they went on their first US tour, a total hungry punk rock tour, says Chris, of 26 dates, starting June 22nd at the Covered Wagon in San Francisco. This was the inaugural run of their trusty white Dodge van, soon nicknamed the Van. Through 3 US tours and 70,000 miles, it never broke down. When it got too hot to drive, they'd pull into a parking garage and just hang out in the van until sundown. Kurt, Chris, Chad, and Jason were their own road managers. They decided where they'd stay and when they'd leave. Of course, the accommodations weren't that great. Most of the time, they'd end up sleeping outside or in the van, or if they were lucky, some fan would give them a floor to sleep on. That would be a story for the grandkids. Oh yeah, Papaw let Kurt Cobain sleep on his floor once. Nobody'd believe him though, right? A few days into the tour, they were deep in the heart of Texas. They parked near a national park, which Chris recalls was essentially a swamp. A sign near their parking spot read, "Caution, alligators." So they dug up a baseball bat and some 2x4s that were kicking around the back of the van and kept them close by in case of any reptilian attack. But eventually they got hungry and decided to eat some of their canned soup. So they doused the bat and the 2x4s in motor oil, set them on fire, and cooked the soup over the flames. They were excited about being on tour and going to places like New Mexico, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, and playing to new faces. They played the very lowest tier of the underground circuit, mostly bars. The band got a free case of beer and never more than $100 a night. But in 1989, $100 for every gig, that's enough for food and gas. It gets you to the next gig, and that's all they really want. They're on a punk rock tour. They don't give a fuck about accommodations. That would come later with Courtney Love's demands. Every time we played a show, says Chad, it seemed like we got just enough money to put gas in the tank and food in our stomach to make it to the next friggin' gig. Despite the marathon drives, the low pay, and often sparse audiences, morale was high and attendance started to pick up halfway through the tour. When college radio began playing Bleach tracks like School About a Girl and Blue, by the time they got out to the Midwest, they almost felt famous. They started to win fans with their live shows, too. There was always people who came up afterward and said, "Wow, I thought you guys were cool," says Chad, but it's not like people got completely out of hand. There were some people who got like that, but they were drunk. Chris was in charge of getting paid and keeping the books. It was a lot simpler then. We'd go to a record store and we'd all buy these records, says Chris. Maybe I could buy 6 records. Kurt would buy 4 records, Chad would buy 3, and that was fine. It was all together, brothers. And at the end of the tour, whoever got dropped off first, we'd count out all the money, a third for you, a third for you, a third for you. Not that Chris would just fritter away the band's money. In fact, he became such a tightwad that he wouldn't let anyone turn on the air conditioning in the van, even in Texas in July, because it used too much fuel. Back home in Washington, Kurt and Chris often went a separate way from Chad socially. Chad stuck with his hippie-ish Bainbridge Island crowd, but being on tour was different. When we were in that van, it was way closer, Chad says. It wasn't like us against each other. It wasn't like us against each other. It wasn't like, I think what he meant to say is it wasn't like them against me or me against them. It was like us against whatever's outside this van. Inside the van, they'd listen to a tuneful but twisted Scottish band called the Vaselines, as well as everything from the teenaged English pop band to Lula Gosh to the aged headbangers in Motorhead. And they'd listen to the Beatles. Chris and Kurt made compilation tapes. Shelley had even made some too. Chris was hitting the bottle pretty hard. He'd get pretty crazy, thrashing things and stuff, Chad recalls. When he'd first get wasted, he'd be all, everybody's great, I love everybody. And then the next moment, he's telling everybody, you don't know anything about love. You just don't care, you don't understand. And he'd pick up a chair and maybe toss it a half a mile. Then he'd wake up and he'd say to me, don't talk to me, Mr. Sunshine. I don't want to deal with you right now. He'd always wake up looking and feeling like shit all the time. Kurt was more amused than disturbed by Chris drinking. It never seemed like a big deal to me at all, he says. Everyone gets drunk, and he didn't get drunk every single night. It was just every other night. When he drinks to the point of oblivion. He turns into literally a retard. He can't speak. All he can do is gesture and knock things over. I just never thought of it as a problem, although I'm probably more sympathetic to it now over the last few years. But I've known so many people that drink that it seems like an ordinary thing. At a tour stop in Minneapolis, the band stayed with Babes in Toyland drummer Lori Barbero, a famed hostess of indie bands who were traveling through the Twin Cities. Apparently, Chris thought Barbero had shot him a look and he hollered, quit your gawkin', flailed his arms and fell backward into a cabinet full of plates, which all went crashing to the floor. He never meant any harm or anything, says Chad. If he was in his right mind, he would have never done some of the shit he did. I think drinking brought out some things that he didn't think about. Don't you just hate it when the fucking pages stick together? Much that he didn't think about much, or things he'd like to say to people that he wouldn't when he wasn't wasted. Pressed for specific incidents, Chad replies, it's all blurring together now. When I think about it, I just see him wasted, and then something getting broken. Kurt would do some pretty weird stuff himself. In Chicago, he bought a large crucifix at a garage sale. Out on the road, he'd roll down the window of the van, stick out the crucifix at some unsuspecting victim, and snap his picture just to get the expression on their face. Yes, life on the road was pretty good. We were totally poor, says Kurt, but God, we were seeing the United States for the first time, and we were in a band, and we were making enough money to survive. It was awesome. It was great. And if Jason wasn't such a prick, it would have been even better. Chris had noticed Jason's dissatisfaction early in the tour and mentioned it to Chad and Kurt. We tried to talk to him about it, and he wouldn't talk to us, says Chris. He got totally introverted. Chris and Kurt would often go for long strolls and talk. During a stroll around Lake Mendota in Madison, Wisconsin, Chris asked, do you think the band was kind of weird ever since Jason joined? It's not the same band anymore. The band was looking and sounding more rock, as Bruce Pavitt would say. They blamed it on Jason. Jason's stage style was more showbiz than the rest of the band. He posed, swinging his hair in the classic SubPop style, doing a raucous rooster strut around his side of the stage. He was like a peacock on amphetamine, says Kurt. He was so posy, and I couldn't believe it. It was embarrassing. It was so contrived and sexual. It was gross. Actually, Jason's incompatibility had been plain from the start. It was weird because he didn't even want to rehearse any new numbers, says Chris. He'd go through the set, but he didn't want to jam or anything. He'd set his guitar down. Jason denies this, saying that since the band was so far flung, they only rehearsed a handful of times before touring and that jamming was out of the question since their time was completely occupied by learning songs that Kurt had already written. We just kind of noticed that, yeah, Jason's kind of weird, says Chris, who also sensed a raucous tendency in Jason early on. The first day we practiced, he brought these girls over to kind of just hang out. That kind of tells you something. Neither Kurt nor Chris hung out with Jason much socially, and their alienation was only magnified by the rigors of the road. Things started getting weird, says Chris, and then he started getting weird. The band played a great show at the Sonic Temple in Pittsburgh, so great that Kurt smashed one of his favorite guitars, a Sunburst Fender Mustang. Jason got really mad about that. We said, what? It's rock and roll, says Chris, who concedes that we were broke and he was kind of financing the show. The band had begun thrashing their instruments a few months before. If it was a bad show, they'd get angry and smash everything up. If it was a really good show, they'd smash everything up out of pure glee. There were few merely average shows, so equipment got smashed often. It all started on October 30th, 1988 at a show at a dorm of Evergreen State College. It just started, says Chris. It was fun. It seemed like you couldn't end a show without doing something spectacular or sensational. No matter how good you played, it seemed like you didn't give it enough. So if you smashed all the gear and had this big gala ending, we could say, there, we did it. We couldn't just walk off the stage. I believe drum smashing started with The Who, right? I think that's where the Melvins got it from. On tour, they'd find cheap guitars at pawn shops. Sometimes fans would just give them a guitar, or in a pinch, Jonathan Poneman would FedEx one out to them and string them left-handed and smash them that night. It was fun, and if you were doing a shitty show, it kind of made it spectacular, says Chris. Then it became addictive. Chris had recently scrawled the phrase Nirvana, fudge-packing, crack-smoking, Satan-worshipping motherfuckers on a wall and was so pleased with the slogan that he told Kurt about it. Kurt put it on the back of a t-shirt design he had been working on. On the front was a reproduction of an engraving of one of the circles of hell from Dante's Inferno, a book Kurt had discovered during his days passing the time in the Aberdeen Library. Jason had all the t-shirts printed up, paid for them, and then sold them after every show. They quickly became a staple of indie rock fashion. Jason probably made a mint. They were supposed to go up into Canada, but it made it only as far as New York City, where they played a lousy show on the 18th of July during the New Music Seminar at the Pyramid Club in the East Village. It was Jason's last show with Nirvana. I don't think Jason really took the pressure of being on tour and being cooped up with us very well, says Chris. I don't think he was happy with our band because he kind of wanted us to be more rock and we were more punk. We started making it toward New York, and that's when Jason started getting really quiet, Chris continues. He wouldn't even talk to us anymore. That's when we first met Anton Brooks, our publicist in the UK. He was like, "Who's this Jason? Why is he so quiet?" The Mudhoney guys were in New York. "Why is this Jason so quiet? We played this show at Maxwell's in nearby Hoboken, New Jersey. It was a good show. Still, Jason was quiet. We spent about 4 days in New York. The New Music Seminar. We watched Sonic Youth and Mudhoney and Lapping Hyenas at the Ritz. Jason went to see the speed metal band Prong at CBGB's. You know what I mean?" That said a lot. That's when Chad and I and Kurt got really together, says Chris. We bonded. We'd go out to eat together, all three, and pitch in for the meal with the band money. Without Jason, he would not hang out with us. They stayed for a few days at the Alphabet City apartment of Janet Billig, a factotum at Caroline Records who knew Pavitt and Poneman, and like Babes in Toyland's Lori Barbero in Minneapolis, made her apartment a way station for needy bands coming through town. One night, Chris and Kurt went down to the street and bought some cocaine. The two of them drank some booze and snorted the coke off Billig's boobs. I meant toilet seat. And they decided they were going home and that Jason was out of the band. We were happy, says Chris. It was a relief. So we went up to him. "Jason, what's wrong? Is there a problem?" He'd say, "Oh, no, nothing. I'm over it." We're like, "What's it? Why is there a problem?" Kurt wouldn't confront Jason about it. He was never in your face, says Chad. Things would pile up for him underneath, and finally it would be, "Man, I can't take this anymore." When we were dealing with Jason, because we were all wondering what was up with him, Kurt was always silent about it. Then out of the blue, he'd say, "Man, I can't take this anymore." It was like, whoa, Kurt's going to say something. I think it's because he's afraid of talking to the person. He doesn't want to bum them out. He doesn't want to be the one to say, "This isn't working out and you're out of the band." He hates that kind of confrontation. He doesn't want to be the executioner or the mean guy. "I always felt kind of peripheral," says Jason. "I don't remember ever being asked for input on songs in that band, which is ultimately why I left." Well, that's because you had Kurt Cobain as a singer-songwriter. You didn't need to put anything in. Kurt does concede that Jason may also have taken exception to Kurt's alcohol-fueled, volatile personality at the time. Kurt also thinks Jason mistook the metallic ring of bleach for the band's true direction instead of the compromise that it was. Even Jason acknowledges that he preferred ponderous songs like Paper Cuts, Sifting, and Big Long Now to the more melodic material Kurt was getting into. Jason never was afraid to declare that he liked metal. That was always kind of a burr in Kurt and Chris' side because it wasn't exactly cool, Jason says. But if there's a band with a cool song and a cool guitar riff, I'm going to listen to it. Jason, who was also a songwriter, wanted to have more input into the music. "I probably wanted to do things that were not simple enough for them, ideas that were mine as opposed to Kurt's," says Jason. "There wasn't a tremendous musical difference. Maybe it was just a control thing. Basically, anybody besides Kurt or Chris is kind of disposable," Jason continues. "At the end of the day, Kurt could get in front of any bass player and any drummer and play his songs, and it's not going to sound that much different." They abruptly canceled the remaining 7 shows of the tour, mostly Midwest dates, and drove home to Washington in 50 hours. not stopping for anything except to get gas, eat a donut, or go to the bathroom. The whole time, nobody said a word. Nobody even told Jason that he was out of the band. Jason claims he actually quit. No, we were just too maladjusted to tell him to his face, Chris says. We just didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and that just compounded the problem. I think we're better at it now, more direct, more mature than back then. If I would have been in the band when they got huge, I'm sure I would have took my money and said, see you later, says Jason. I would have done whatever I wanted to do. I'd bail and just do whatever. Artistically, I think it was totally the right thing for me to do, says Jason of his departure from the band. Economically, maybe not. 2 weeks later, Jason got a call from Chris Cornell of Soundgarden asking him to play bass in the band. He lasted a month before being replaced by Ben Shepherd and now plays guitar in Mindfunk, a band on Megaforce Records. He says he has no hard feelings about his exit from Nirvana. Each band is a weird, twisted family, Jason says. I think I was more the retarded stepchild twice removed. The band never did repay Jason the $600 he lent them for bleach. Mental damages, says Kurt. My God, who would want to be the guy that got removed from not one great band, but two great bands? This dude had a chance with Nirvana, immediately had a chance with Soundgarden, and he blew both chances. Kurt had become obsessed with the great Lead Belly, the black folk troubadour of the 30s and 40s, whose enduring musical legacy includes Rock Island Line, Midnight Special, and Goodnight Irene. Kurt had gotten into Lead Belly after reading an article by William Burroughs which said something like, "To hell with the modern day rock and roll. If you want to hear real passion, listen to Lead Belly." Kurt's next-door neighbor, Slim Moon, happened to have Lead Belly's last sessions and played it for Kurt. He was completely taken aback. Then he started buying all the Lead Belly records he could find. It's so raw and sincere, Kurt says. It's something that I hold really sacred to me. Lead Belly is one of the most important things in my life. I'm totally obsessed with him. He went out and bought every Lead Belly record he could find, learned how to play his music, and even decorated an entire wall of the apartment with Lead Belly pictures. It's easy to see Kurt's attraction to the blues and exorcism of psychic pain, but it's also easy to see why he was especially attracted to Lead Belly, whose work transcended any category, an elegant songwriter who crafted sturdy but melodic music that synthesized several different genres, whose passionate music spoke volumes about the human experience. From Lead Belly and the blues, Kurt got the idea of using recognizable imagery to produce an original, almost mystical version. Kurt had befriended Mark Lanigan, whose band The Screaming Trees played in Olympia often. In August 1989, Kurt and Lanigan decided to collaborate on some songs for Lanigan's solo album. Unfortunately, Kurt couldn't write very well with someone else. He kept worrying that he would come up with something that he'd want to use for Nirvana instead, so they decided to record some songs by Lead Belly with Chris on bass and Screaming Trees' Mark Pickerel on drums. The group wound up recording but two Lead Belly songs. Where Did You Sleep Last Night wound up on Lanigan's magnificent solo album, The Winding Sheet. Kurt sang Lead Belly's Ain't It a Shame. Both songs were to make up a single, but that fell through, and Ain't It a Shame was never released. Jonathan Poneman calls it one of Kurt's greatest vocal performances. Eventually, the four turned into an informal blues band. Pickerel wanted to call it The Jury. Kurt wanted to call it Lithium. Poneman had big plans for an album, but somehow it never happened. Kurt concentrated on guitar, leaving Lanigan to do most of the vocals. Dylan Carlson remembers their best song was Grey Goose, which they did in a heavy dirge blues style. It was almost like watching one of the great English blues rock bands getting its feet, says Carlson. It was pretty incredible. Kurt says he'd like to try a blues band again sometime. Nirvana rehearsed and played a few shows in Seattle that summer as their following began to swell, strictly by word of mouth, since SubPop had long ago ceased directly promoting the album. Yeah, they didn't even promote Bleach. And remember, the first single, Love Buzz, they only printed 1,000 copies. They didn't promote Bleach, but it just continued to sell by word of mouth. Hey, you gotta hear this guy's vocals. That's what people were saying. The freeze-dried vocals. They regularly sold out the Vogue and went on a 2-week Midwest tour starting in late September to make up the dates they had missed by coming home prematurely with Jason. Along for the ride was roadie Ben Shepherd. Ben Shepherd was a roadie for Nirvana? I did not know that. Ben Shepherd of Soundgarden, once upon a time, a roadie for Nirvana until he replaces Jason Everman in Soundgarden. Wow. Maybe that's why he's such a humble, modest, down-to-earth guy. He was kind of crazy sometimes, but that's okay. I'd rather have that than some moody metalhead. Shepherd later replaced Jason in Soundgarden. The bigger the city, the bigger the crowd. The best show was at the Blind Pig in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Everybody was totally into it, says Chad. They were raging and it was great. It's still one of the band's favorite places to play. In Ann Arbor, they also interviewed comedian Bobcat Goldthwait on a radio show. All Kurt had to do was mention Sylvester Stallone, and Goldthwait went on a half-hour rip about why the man who played Rambo fled to Switzerland to avoid the Vietnam War draft. In Minneapolis, right at the start of the tour, Kurt had collapsed from stomach pain. Chris was frightened. His stomach, God. He had nothing to throw up, and he was still throwing up, he says. His stomach hurt so bad, took him to the hospital, and they could do nothing for him. Once they got back from the tour, Chris and Shelley decided to get married, and the band began preparing to record material for an EP. They would first record 7 songs on a cassette deck by simply putting a cassette player in the middle of the room and hitting record and play. That tape would be passed around through their friends, their fans. People would make copies of it. It was, very lo-fi punk rock thing to do. That's what people did back then. You make mixtapes for people, whatever. They would go on to make a 7-song demo professionally, but the very first Nevermind, anything that represented what Nevermind would be, was done by Kurt with a simple cassette deck. And I think that's pretty cool because Nirvana gained popularity within the underground music scene from that cassette deck. Now that's badass. That's when you know you have good songs, that they can be that lo-fi, that distorted, that staticky, that shitty, and people still are like, make me a copy of that. I want that. And that's why Kurt knew we're going to be big, because people lost their fucking mind over the lowest production demo you could have. What are they going to do when we have a professional copy of these songs? And this is what we are getting into in the next chapter. Butch Vig will hear that original cassette demo. Susan Silver will hear that original cassette demo and actually set Nirvana up with an attorney to guard Kurt's intellectual property. And we'll go from there. Thank you so much if you've been watching. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It's not going to kill you. And leave me a like just because you can. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.